Welcome to the Six Conditions podcast, where we explore the science and art of great teams. Join show hosts Drs. Ruth Wagaman and Krister Lowe for pithy summaries of great research being done on teams and organizations, as well as inspired and artful approaches for using those ideas to enable brilliant collaborations. Let's get today's conversation started.
Welcome back, everyone, to the Six Team Conditions podcast, the science and art of great teams. Here we are in episode number 7. We actually pre-recorded episode number 7, but this episode is coming out in early April 2020 during the time of the coronavirus. And Ruth and I felt it'd be really important to re-record an introduction. So you're actually going to get 2 introductions to this episode, but we wanted to share a few words with you about the coronavirus and really connecting what's going on with this pandemic to actually the topic of today, which is around the 3 key task processes. So Ruth, why don't we kick it over to you? What would you like to say to the listeners here at the outset of this episode, just about coronavirus, your musings, observations, anything to get us warmed up for today's episode on the 3 key task processes?
Yeah, there are a few things that I would like to share. Today in particular, my heart is especially breaking for New York City. So I want to send my love and support out to people who are in New York. I also have the vast majority of my family are in New Jersey, so I'm carrying fair bit of worry about them as well. I've also been really both struck and really warmed by how good people are being to each other and how much we are reaching out to each other to connect through technology. And with respect to what I've been thinking about the impact on teams, I think there are probably 3 big themes for me right now. One is how crucial excellent teamwork is on the front lines of healthcare at the moment, and how challenging it has to be for people who are coming from other places to try and meet the needs in particularly hard hit settings, and the challenge that teams face in forming in new configurations and doing good teamwork when they're coming together for the first time. So that is very much on my mind. The second one is how stretched many people are in trying to continue their collaborations virtually, and how difficult that is, and how many team leaders are really at a loss for how to help their teams, both how to help their teams just cope with what's coming at them, but also knowing just a few helpful things that they could do to keep teams productive and effective right now. And then the last thing that has been really striking to me is how important it has been when our communities have gathered. You and I have been in a couple of different gatherings lately, how important it has been just to give everybody room to check in and say something about how they're doing and how all this is landing on them, rather than trying to dive into the the work of the day. How about you, Krister?
I think that's that theme around just creating spaces for resilience for all of us, and including the teams that we're part of. Well, just to start off, want to send want to send to the listeners out there just well wishes, and wishing you all safety and well-being, and that you and your families are managing well. This is obviously an unprecedented time, and for many of us, we've never gone through something like this. And so I think, just like all of you, I'm experiencing kind of the full range of human emotions. And the way I've been capturing it in the last couple of days, it's a simultaneous loss of lots of things that, we used to hold on to: routines, habits, ways of working, just, things that we took for granted, even just going outside your house and being able to go, go shopping or go for a stroll in the park, some of those things. So there's on one level, there's loss, and simultaneously there's all these creative energies that are being unlocked, right? So it's almost like a time of, the world is almost pregnant. It's like spring now. It's like a time of opportunity. So I'm really struck at these 2 poles, and I'm even finding it within myself. Like on some days I'm really depressed, honestly, and then I'm really heartbroken and sad. I'm in New Jersey, southern New Jersey, and just hearing the stories. I'm from New York City, so I have a lot of connections and networks. I know of people that are sick, have passed from coronavirus, and then on the other hand, I'm also finding like this kind of springtime of new opportunity, lots of things shifting. Certain kinds of work with teams is drying up, and the new opportunities are coming up. So yeah, I find that really like the full range of human experience is on is being engaged right now, but at all levels of system, right? And when I look around the world at the state of teams, I'm seeing, like you, the frontline folks really diving in, lots of innovation happening, lots of shifts to virtual. And then also, I'm also seeing like where we need more collaboration here in the United States between the states and the federal government. Like, there's a lot of, there's going to be a lot of postmortems, I think, after this, or there's going to be a lot of after action reviews after this is all over around gaps in our ability to collaborate. But, when I look at the whole global level, it's really calling for collaboration on an unprecedented scale, right? And so, I think short term, I'm heartbroken and pessimistic about, unfortunately, the coming weeks and even months of how bad it may get and the loss of life. But I think in the long term, I'm an optimist, and I think we're going to come through this. I hope we come through this for the better at all levels of society. And my heart just goes out to everybody out there that's being directly impacted by this. And again, it's touching all of us, on lots of multiple levels. But, I think today's episode, which we're getting into, Ruth, is around the 3 key task processes. And, so I think there's definitely linkages to the content we're going to be talking about in this episode, which, again, we previously recorded. But I'm curious for you, Ruth, as you think about the 3 key task processes, what might you want to say here about linking up today's content and what we're going to be getting into in the episode to, the challenge at hand with COVID-19?
Well, one of the things I've been thinking a lot about is absolutely relevant to the key task processes. I mentioned that I'm concerned for all these newly configured teams that are going to have to continually happen right now. And one of the risks in newly configured teams is the inability, when we don't know each other, to use the full complement of talents, of knowledge and skill and experience that's necessary in a crisis moment. Because in brand new teams, we don't really know where the knowledge, skill, and experience is located unless we make an intentional effort to find that. So that one is particularly on my mind. I've also been mulling about some of the special challenges to teams of operating virtually, and how tempting it is when you when you're struggling to connect to each other through technology. It's very tempting to disaggregate interdependent work into individual tasks and let people go off and do it themselves. And that turns out to be a pretty significant process loss for teams, because once again, they're not using the full complement of talent on some of the complex parts of the work, but they also struggle then with their task strategies and their ability to coordinate the different individual pieces. Now, that's not to say that it can't be done. Actually, I think all of the process gains that we're going to talk about in this episode are possible in virtual work, but it does take, I think, a higher degree of intentionality. That's pretty much what's been running through my mind. How about you? How do you connect the processes to what's going on now?
I think I've already mentioned a few of them. So I think around one of the key task processes around effort, which really links up to motivation. And so I'm noticing a lot of that, both drags on motivation, but also accelerants on motivation. And I'm seeing that, with a lot of the teams out there. And, some of the things you mentioned, really needing to disrupt strategies around how we're getting the work done, and just finding, creative ways to use the talent in our team, which is always a challenge for teams, regardless of whether they're, working face-to-face or in mixed formats, some face-to-face or virtual. So I think this is a really relevant topic. And, I think as we get into the episode, what you're going to see is that the immediate predictors of the team effectiveness outcomes that we spoke about in the last episode are these 3 key task processes. And so this time that we're living in around the coronavirus, we're seeing a lot of symptoms, a lot of indicators emerging in these 3 key task processes. And, if we peel back the layers of the onion, it's the 6 conditions that really drive a lot of these. So I think as you go through this episode, and we're going to be sharing, examples and introducing the 3 key task processes and sharing stories, you might reflect on what are you noticing right now during the coronavirus around how the 3 key task processes, what are the symptoms that are showing up in the teams that you're a part of? And so we hope you find this a rich episode. And with that, we are going to pivot over now to the previously recorded content, and we look forward to seeing you in this episode and in future ones. And thanks for joining us. Take care. Welcome back, everyone, to the Six Conditions podcast, where we're exploring the science and art of great teams. Hey, Ruth, good to see you. Today, we're going to be talking about the 3 key task processes here in episode number 7. How are you?
I'm doing really well. Thanks, Krister. Great to be with you as always.
Indeed, indeed. So as we like to do here on the show, we usually like to warm it up a bit with some banter here at the outset. So I'm curious for you, Ruth, what's percolating in the mind of Dr. Ruth Wagaman today on the subject of teams to help us get warmed up?
Yeah, really, it actually really is percolating. It's I had a recent request to help a group of people that are working on developing the effectiveness of a board of directors of a major global firm. And they're just trying to generate some really good principles and practices for how to help a board, as I would say it, is get the most out of the very high level of knowledge, skill, talent, and experience that they've got in the room. I gather that there is a tendency to be a little bit of grandstanding, and it's a very large group of people. So the request from the board chair actually has helped me think about some ways of helping this board to be the best board it can be.
How many people are in it?
It's 24.
Wow.
And a really very high level of talent and experience in the room.
Okay. Now it's interesting. I had a call from a team coach yesterday who does work. He's getting ready to do some work with a board, and he wanted to chat with me about it. And I said, well, it's not actually totally in my wheelhouse. I don't have much experience working with boards, but I mentioned you and some others that I know do work in that space. How do you like working with boards?
It's very different to me from working with a senior leadership team. I think the principles are very similar in that, clarity of purpose and what's their unique added value to the organization is the first order of business. But it really is working with a large group of people to think how they can use configurations of subgroups and teams to get work done together.
Right.
And it's also a lot about the norms of conduct when there's a full on, full board discussion of some of the issues that are going on in the enterprise. So a question about how to be a good advisor, how to be helpful without being in any way dictatorial to the management team and the chief executive.
There's something there triggered for me just around how do you use the talent that you have when you have a large group like that. And I think that's true, when we help teams get beyond just coming together to share information and updates, it oftentimes really gets at what is the work of the team, the more collaborative work, and how to best use the talent. Is it something that requires everybody to be swarming on, or are there other ways to use especially in larger groups, different configurations of dyads and triads and such to tackle different priorities? Yeah,
exactly.
Cool.
And what are you working on these days?
Yeah. Well, actually, I was triggered by an email I got from one of my clients. I'm working with a team in the natural resources and climate change area, which is a topic that I'm excited to be working in. And I did a launch with them. I'm in the phase now of just providing some ongoing team coaching. And I was really excited because I introduced to them visual management, Kanban, recently. We did a retrospective on what they've learned since our launch 3 months before and what's sticking and where they are. And then I introduced them to Kanban. And I got this lovely message back saying, just wanted to let you know we use Kanban for the first hour of our recent meeting today. Thank you so much for introducing it to us. It led to more interaction, greater participation, helped give the discussion structure. People own different Post-its and to-dos. We all could visualize individual and overall team progress. We were able to shout out some achievements. We came out with a sense of momentum. So part of the reason why I shared that one is just a little success story. But I think it links up a bit to what we're talking about today, which is around the key task processes, the kind of emergent behaviors that we see in groups. And, I think even bringing some structures like visual management can be really powerful to help teams as they go down to the field together, doing the actual work, following a launching type of event, which we'll have in an upcoming episode. I think in episode 9, we're going to be talking about launching and relaunching teams. Yeah.
Yeah. So, anyways, I heard some things in what they were describing as the movement forward that they're feeling as very related to the key task processes that we're the sense of momentum and energy.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But I think a visual aid like a Kanban board, which
Mm-hmm.
helps visualize the work, brings the work into the foreground. And, I asked them this question when I was having a coaching session with them in late last month. And I said, so I see all of you sitting around the room here. This is the team. I said, but where is your work? And many of them started telling me what the work was and what the priorities was. And I said, no, I want to go even more simple and dumb question. I can't see your work. Where is it right now in the room? And one of them pointed to their heads. And I was like, well, exactly. So the work is in your head, your knowledge workers. And unless we visualize and make explicit your work, we're operating with a lot of assumptions that we actually have agreement on what we think the work is. And there's the individual work that the members are doing, and then there's the collective collaborative work. So we ended up visualizing that on a Kanban board with two streams. One was the collaborative work of the team, and the other were the individual priorities that they were in charge of, but it was important for their colleagues to know about. So anyways, yeah. And maybe that's a good way to get started today, to get into the topic of why key task processes. In our last episode, we were talking about measuring the outcomes of teams, 3 team effectiveness outcomes. And in previous episodes, we were talking about the structural drivers of team effectiveness, the 6 conditions. But now we have these intermediary mechanisms, which we call the key task processes. So why don't we kick it off there and talk a little bit about this key question, Ruth, that we wanted to tee up for this episode, which is, where do you look in the short run to decide if a team is effective? How would you know if a team is a great team?
Right.
So how should we get into that, Ruth?
Well, you raised, probably we should start by naming the 3 key task processes, and then talk about why those three are key. And I think all of them have been implicated in what you were describing about teams visualizing their work. So just to start by naming them, the 3 key task processes are the level of effort that team members are putting in their work. So how hard are they working? How much are they building energy and shared commitment to the team and its work? That's one. The second key task process is team task strategy. So to what extent is the team making intelligent, knowledgeable, innovative choices about the way they go about doing the work? And I think actually task strategy has probably helped a lot by the visualization work that you were doing with this team. And then the third one is, how much are they using the full complement of talent they actually have in the team? And we can see signs in these key task processes for better or for worse, right? So you can see that a team is building shared commitment around effort, or you can see a team is operating in ways that alienate each other, for example.
Right.
We'll get into more about how you can use these when you're coaching a team for a moment, but I just wanted to start by naming them and to say that the reason that we focus on these 3 task processes is that they are the aspects of team dynamics that are most closely related to and the strongest predictors in the short run of how well the team is going to perform in the long run.
Yeah. And is it fair to say, Ruth, that the 6 conditions don't directly impact team effectiveness, but they impact team effectiveness through these 3 processes?
They do affect the outcomes through these 3 key task processes. There may be other mechanisms that we haven't discovered, but we are confident from our research that these 3 are the important mediators in the middle.
Yeah. Now, I know in a future episode, we'll talk a little bit about the beginning, middles, and ends and, the coaching of teams. But I know from your 2005 article on a theory of team coaching, you found that oftentimes at the beginning of the stage of a life, teams are really open to coaching around the effort or the, which is around motivational kind of coaching. As they actually cover some ground together, they start to become a bit more open to coaching around the strategy because they now have some runway to look back on and say, okay, this is the distance we covered. Here's what's working. Here's what's not. And midpoints in whatever the cycle of the team can be really powerful. And then as teams get towards the end of cycles, they become increasingly open to coaching around education, around looking at knowledge and skill and how they're, leveraging that as a team and how are they growing as individuals and as team members. So I thought I'd throw that out there because we haven't had a chance really in the podcast to talk about the life cycles and cadences of teams. Yeah. But the key task processes, while they're always all in motion at a given time, they tend to, have times when they're more in the forefront than the others might be at any
Yeah,
given time.
I think that's a great observation. They're all necessary for a team to be effective. So you've got to have high levels of effort, good strategy, and a good use of knowledge and skill in a team where those features matter. But as ways of intervening in the team, there are times when it's a good idea and times when it's not such a good idea around
Right.
each of those. So you were referencing, for example, the differences between beginnings and midpoints in a lot of the research in teams in which interveners, process consultants, or even people doing lab experiments were trying to intervene around team task strategy and to have a conversation about strategy right in the beginning of the life of the group. They just wouldn't take it up.
Right.
Teams really need to grapple with the work and to dive in and do it before they're prepared to have a kind of strategic conversation about their approach to the work.
So I think one question then becomes, when does this become useful? The 3 key task processes. And I'm curious for you, Ruth, how do you use them? When did they become useful for you when you're intervening in teams or when you're being asked to work with teams?
Well, first of all, they're useful for me as a diagnostic. So when you're watching a team's dynamics in action, there's a lot going on. And you want to ask the question, but of all that's going on in the way that people are interacting with each other, which ones of them actually matter to the ultimate effectiveness of the team? And how do I understand why they matter? So I think it's very easy to be observing a team and note the things that don't feel good when, one person's being critical or another, or you see some kind of tension in the room, or, uneven levels of participation. And your instincts may say those are problematic for the team. But for me, the key task processes are what tell me whether something is going to have an ultimate impact on the team and why. So, for example, when I think about these 3 key task processes, to me, they're at the team level, they're an analogy to how we think about what drives team performance. Performance for an individual, right? So you might be familiar with the old equation in psychology: P equals MA.
Yeah.
Performance is equal to motivation times ability.
Right.
So in an individual, it doesn't help to put a tremendous amount of effort into something that you have no native talent for, or have no fundamental ability. That's not going to help you perform, and vice versa. It's not going to help you very much if you have, imagine a tremendous ability at, for example, bowling, but you have no interest in actually doing it, right? So you're not going to get performance if you're not putting effort in. The difference at the team level, and why we have 3, is that performance is a function of motivation at a collective level, which is actually a social dynamic. It's influenced by the process. And the same thing, the analogy to a team's ability are the other 2. It's how much talent and skill and experience is there in the team to be taken advantage of, and then how do they deploy that in their team task strategies. So I'm watching a team through the lens of, is the way that they're operating going to have a positive influence or a negative influence on the level of energy, commitment, effort in the team? Is the way they're operating causing kind of slippages in coordination, or are they showing themselves to be in kind of mindless habitual routines instead of actively talking and explicitly thinking about how to do this work together? Are they operating in ways that may be shutting people out, so they're not using the full range of talent in the team? Or can you actually see some signs that they're building the talent in the team through some kind of mutual teaching and learning? So it's a lens through which I'm watching the dynamic, and I know how to sort for myself and ultimately to help the team sort for itself what's happening in the way they're working together that's helping or hurting them.
Yeah. Well, you know what? I've come to, initially when I learned the 6 conditions framework, it took me a little time to integrate all the elements, and the key task processes took me a little bit more time. But now I've I've come to be much more of a fan of them, because what I notice is that when I get requests to work with teams, the symptoms of lack of team effectiveness are usually showing up in the 3 key task processes, and there's pain around that. And so, I'll get a call, for example, that I have a number of team members that are not getting along, and we have low morale, and a lot of that seems to be linked up to effort. But oftentimes what we'll do is kind of back into the 6 conditions and really find that there's a whole bunch of structural things that are not in place. The team isn't clear about its purpose. It hasn't devised clear priorities or, roles and norms and such. And so once we clean that up, then I think oftentimes it creates some lift in the key task processes. But then as they're moving down the field together, I find just having those 3 things really helpful kind of rubric around where to just be paying attention to where the team is. And, different interventions, they may need different interventions, right? At different stages of moving down the field together. Like I just described, the use of the visual management at the outset of this call actually was having effects on all 3 of those key task processes, right? They were talking about feeling momentum and motivation. They were talking about how it really just helped them, talk about where the work was and, moving some things along. And then, she also mentioned that, people were owning things more and stepping up more, right? So anyway, it's kind of a interesting little illustration of all 3 of the key task processes in action at one time, right?
Yeah, that's really great that there can be interventions like that implicate all 3 task processes and really help the team take a great leap forward on all of them. I've done some of that kind of visualizing work with teams as well, and it's not obvious until they start doing it that it can help them make better use of their knowledge and skill in the team.
Yeah.
So that third process, because they can say, we're not all needed on that, but this subset of people really have a lot to contribute, and they could take that on while we're deploying ourselves in other things going on in parallel.
Yeah. The team coach in me keeps slipping into, how I'm using this as a team coach. So I'm trying to hold back for a few episodes on that. But I was thinking of another one. Like I'll oftentimes start a team coaching session by trying to build some motivation, right? And so one of them is, I introduced to a team recently, Acknowledgment. So teams oftentimes have very weak muscles around how to acknowledge team members and to create a positive climate for work. And so just by starting off, I was with an IT leadership team a couple of weeks ago, and I said, let's just start off, and what I'd love to do is have each of you just share an acknowledgement of one team member who really, something you appreciate about what they did for the team. Not team acknowledgement, because it's a lot easier to give a global acknowledgement than to single out an individual. And they loved it. I said after 5 minutes of just doing that, I'm like, so what'd you guys think about that? And they said, it just feels really good. We never take time, and they're like, now we got to do this for all our teams, but I think it was a way of influencing one of the key task processes right in the moment to influence the work we were going to do that day, which was a 3-hour session. So
that's a lovely observation, and a very simple but powerful intervention, and paying attention to timing, right? Motivation is particularly excellent to deal with at the beginnings of things. I'll give you, since we're on team coaching, I'll give you another illustration of something I'm doing around the key task processes. We said earlier that teams they're not really open to talking about task strategy until they've logged some time. And they're especially open to that as a midpoint. So I have been coaching some of my teams, when they have, for example, a 2-hour meeting, to pause at 1 hour and to say, okay, let's just take a look at what's really working in the way that we've been operating for the first hour. And let's name one thing that we want to do differently, whether it's, re-emphasize something positive we were doing, or shift something that's getting in our way for the second half of the meeting. So it's real time self-coaching and task improvement, but taking account of that midpoint openness to changing strategy.
Yeah, that triggered an anecdote for me around a finance team I was working with for a day, and they had carved out 1 hour during the day to have one of their own discussions where I wasn't facilitating or coaching. And I just faded to the back, and I just sat there and observed, and I just jotted down how many times people spoke. And I've shared this story, I think, with you before, Ruth, but I found that the team leader spoke 80 to 90% of the time. the deputy spoke like the rest, and everybody else accounted for the remaining 5%. And, sharing that in the middle of our day was just really striking to them. And it led to a real conversation around how the leader was saying, well, I'm talking and I ask the group for input. And when it gets quiet, nobody says anything, then I keep talking. And it was just really helpful to pause the action and, then leverage that insight for the rest of the day to really get more of the team in the room, right? Which not only influenced the strategy of how we were working, but really about, leveraging the talent in the room more than just relying on two people, and really just one who was doing most of the lifting.
That's really great. Again, a visualization technique, right? Showing
Yeah.
them something that they might not be seeing about their
Yeah.
practice. So I wanted to raise something. We've been talking about how the key task processes can be useful to coaches, right? So thinking about diagnostically what's going on in the team, paying attention to timing, and intervening on the key task processes at the right time. I wonder if you have some thoughts or observations about how the idea of task processes can be useful to team leaders or to teams themselves.
Yeah, well, what's coming up for me in our conversation just is around time frames and scale. So you can use the key task processes in one session, which we spoke about, if you're in an hour, 2 hours, 3 hours a day. But I think there's then, the cadence of a team, and whether the teams you're with are working in 3 months cadences, or, maybe they're in month sprints or annual cycles. Many teams work in, annual cycles. I think for team leaders and teams, it can be very valuable to look at where are we in our team's life cycle, and which of the key task processes are more needing attention or more in our focus. So at the beginning of a year, it's oftentimes, or at the beginning of a cycle, it's time to revisit purpose and get excited about what it is we want to accomplish together. A lot of that gets into the effort part and stoking the effort piece and getting clarity around that. And I think, drilling back into the 6 conditions to do some work on your compelling purpose and on your sound structure, getting some really clear mission critical tasks identified, and, how are we going to work differently? If we're going to feed some of our learning in from the past cycle, what shifts do we want to make? So I think a lot of that, tends to naturally lend itself to the beginning of a cycle. As the team is moving down the field again, the mid phase is a great time to pause. I like to do retrospectives with teams, so look backs, using simple techniques. Even one of my favorites is something called the 4 L's. What have we liked about the ways we've been working? What have we learned? What's been lacking in our ways of working, and what are we longing for? And, a simple technique like that can just, again, using Post-its and, capturing them on a wall, can really lead to a rich discussion around shifts we need to make in our approach to the work, or maybe even what the priorities themselves, right? So I think that's an example there. And, again, as the team moves along, finding opportunities to induce more individual and collective learning, reflecting on how we're using the talent. And I like what you were saying at the top of the show today, Ruth, about the board. How do we use 24 people in a smart way? Not just coming together to share information periodically, but in between meetings, what are we doing to use that talent on behalf of the group in a smarter way, right? So I think that becomes interesting. And one of the things I've been trying to help team leaders do is to think about, use your team as a resource, almost like as a weapon, right, to win. And think about the configurations of your talent and how you could be using them well. If they're coming to you with a lot of their problems rather than going to each other, foster some interdependent work for them to be doing in dyads or triads that are really beneficial to the team and the organization. Not busy work, but real, strategic work. And I think you'll find that will probably, generate all kinds of good effects for you in terms of not just motivated team members, but they're going to grow more, they're going to be more engaged, and, probably have some performance impact as well. So anyways, those are a handful of things that come up to me as I think about a life cycle of a team. And again, whether it's a shorter life cycle of a month, 3 months, 6 months, or a whole year, the key task processes, I think, give you a great lens to look through what's needed in the team at a given time.
Yeah. What you're saying brings up 2 thoughts for me that I think are important to our listeners in reflecting on how to use these 3 key task processes. One is that I find that a lot of teams and a lot of leaders, when you focus them on these task-related processes, find that to be a relief, right? So if there are tensions in the group and things are and they're performing less well than they could be, I think there is this sort of fear and dread that we're going to have to get into some hard personal conversations with each other.
Yeah.
And in fact, you can get a long way. And in fact, the more powerful point of leverage on performance is to be paying attention to those processes that are directly related to the work, rather than the more relational stuff. And I'm not suggesting that I think relationships are unimportant. I think they're important in and of themselves, but they're in a different place in the causal chain in what really drives team effectiveness. So, relationships are another, positive relationships are another excellent outcome of getting the conditions right. And of accomplishing meaningful things together.
I tend to think of it a little bit as icing on the cake. I find that when a team is going well, even a team we're a part of, Ruth, when we're kind of clicking and performing, it creates a lot of motivation. And then I like my team members more. Right. And then it becomes kind of a virtuous cycle. So then I'm more motivated. I like my team members more. I'm more willing to, maybe give more of myself to team members or, so I think it has that kind of effect. But I agree with you in terms of the causal chain. It's funny. I was on a call yesterday with a team coach that called me, and he was asking for my help. He's more of a one-on-one coach, and he has a potential to work with in the real estate industry with the top team. And he said the team is a little bit broken because they had another team facilitator come in where he had them in a swimming pool telling stories about their past. And one person had like a traumatic past and started crying, and they said it was a total disaster. You can imagine this very senior team in a pool. I don't know where they were, somewhere in a warm climate, and it totally backfired. And so I think he was, he and the CEO were taking a little bit of heart that, by grounding in some science with the 6 conditions framework, the team diagnostic survey, which we'll be talking about in our next episode, seemed like a good place to kind of get the team back on the horse, so to speak, and moving again. And, and I think, what I find is when teams have had bad experiences like that, by starting with some work on the structure, on the task, grounding in some science, it oftentimes very, very quickly reestablishes the safety to be able to push into more artful kind of approaches and things like that. So anyways, it's good stuff.
That's a great story. So back, just one last thing on the causal chain that came up for me as you were describing some of the things that you do to work on the task processes. It's to take us back to the recognition that the most important drivers of positivity and growth in those 3 task processes are in the 6 conditions, right? So there are, to give one example, if you wanted to stack the deck in favor of a team putting as much of its effort and commitment and really building shared commitment to the team and its work, your greatest points of leverage are to invite a team into a really compelling purpose that has high levels of consequentiality, and then to give them work that allows them to use their full range of talent and judgment, and that really makes sense to be done by a team, and then to reward them and recognize them for team excellence. Like that is the recipe for motivation, and those are all fundamentally part of the 6 conditions. And then to illustrate around strategy, if you want to set a team up to develop really excellent, innovative, uniquely suited task approaches, you want to make sure that the purpose is clear, so they're all headed in the same direction. You want to make sure that they are a small enough team and that have some explicit norms of conduct, particularly around learning. And you want to set them up with the information systems that would give them the data that they need to make good judgments about their work. So these are, I don't mean to lay these out as formulas, because
simple cause and effect.
The way that the conditions drive the task process is all kinds of interaction effects. I just wanted to explain the causal flow here, which is you set the team up really well on the 6 conditions, and that puts you in a great position to coach the key task processes in a positive and high impact way.
Yeah. I think, when I introduce the framework to teams, I oftentimes will talk about the 6 conditions as the inputs, the 3 key task processes as the throughputs. It's more the emergent dynamics and processes. And then there's the outputs, which are the outcomes, right? Of the 3 team effectiveness outcomes.
Exactly.
Well, good stuff, Ruth. I think we should reserve some of the content here for future episodes, but I think we've already spent a good 30 minutes on this topic, and hopefully, the listeners found this useful. If folks want to learn more about the 3 key task processes, where could they look?
We spend a lot of time laying out the key task processes and explaining why they're important, and teaching about their place in coaching and the ideas around timing in Richard Hackman and my article called Toward a Theory of Team Coaching that we published in the Academy of Management Review in 2005. I'd also give a shout out to Colin Fisher, who's a colleague of ours as well, who has written a lot about team coaching and task processes.
Yeah. I know you and I also, Ruth, have a chapter in the Practitioner's Handbook of Team Coaching on something we call the 60-30-10 rule, designing, launching, and coaching teams. And in there, we talk a little bit about what we call structural coaching, which is more about putting in place the 6 conditions, and then the emergent process coaching around, which a lot of it targets the 3 key task processes. So that may be another resource for folks to look at. But again, we'll be speaking a little bit more in a future episode about the ongoing coaching of teams, and we'll pick up this conversation and go a little bit deeper in it. So let's wrap up today's episode, and thank you all for tuning in, and tee up next episode. Episode number 8 is going to be on the Team Diagnostic Survey, which is a formal assessment of teams on the 6 conditions, the 3 key task processes, and the 3 team effectiveness outcomes, those criteria. And so the question is really here: how can you use the Team Diagnostic Survey to support team effectiveness? When is a formal assessment worth using? So we'll leave you with those questions. How can you use the Team Diagnostic Survey to support team effectiveness? And when is a formal assessment worth using? So with that, Ruth, anything to say here in parting? Otherwise, we'll say goodbye to the listeners.
No, thanks, and looking forward to our next conversation.
Okay, see you then. Bye.
Thanks for tuning in to today's episode. For show notes, links to great resources mentioned in the podcast, and for more information, go to 6teamconditions.com. See you next time on the 6 Conditions Podcast.